Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending the John Hazen White Senior Lecture, sponsored by the John Hazen White family. It was endowed in 1993 in memory of John Hazen White Sr., a prominent Rhode Island business leader whose family company, Taco, is currently run by his son, John Hazen White Jr., who, as you know, also supports a lot of other public interest endeavors. The John Hazen White Lecture addresses timely political and policy issues facing the nation and has featured a number of different speakers in the past, including Professor John Aldrich from Duke University, our friend Darrell West, who used to run the Taubman Center, former Governor of Ohio John Kasich, Representative James Clyburn from South Carolina, and then Senator John Kerry. So today, I'm going to describe our panelists and run of show, how it's all going to go. And then we'll have a short public service announcement before that from Brown Votes, and then we'll get started. So this is the John Hazen White Senior Lecture, which is a forum on election security with Ken Block and John Marion. I'm privileged to know these individuals in various iterations of my time at Brown. I am currently the Allison Ressler Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Taubman Center and the Interim Director of the Watson Institute as we move to a School of International and Public Affairs. And in my prior life, I have commented on politics. I still do on occasion. So I've had the pleasure of being on panels, of witnessing their incredible commentary and the work that they do. And so I'm very pleased to introduce each of them. So Ken Block is the author of a relatively new book called Disproven, My Unbiased Search for voter fraud for the Trump campaign, the data that shows why he lost, and how we can improve our elections. Ken Block, as you recall, is the founder of the Moderate Party in Rhode Island and a former candidate for governor. He'll share his findings on voter fraud and electoral security. And I urge everybody to pay very close attention. It's somewhat frightening how we actually collect and count ballots in this country. But Ken Block will illuminate the process for us. John Marion has been the longtime executive director of Common Cause Rhode Island, and he's bringing his expertise today in voting rights and election administration to our conversation. Together, they'll explore the pressing issues of election security, the integrity of election administration, and the future of voting rights. So we're very excited. So the run of show will be that each guest will be speaking for about 15 minutes each, give or take, whatever you'd like to speak for. And then they'll come back to the table. I have a set of questions I'm prepared to ask them, but I'm also going to open it up to our audience, and we'll be passing around microphones so you don't have to get up to ask the questions. We are not live streaming, but we are recording this event, and it will be put up on both the Taubman website and the Watson YouTube channel, so everybody will be able to see it. So before we start, I'd like to invite a representative of Brown Votes to come up and explain where we are in the voting registration and voting process for Rhode Island.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today, and thank you to our speakers. My name is Rosie. I'm a new intern with Taubman, and I also work with Brown Votes. And I just wanted to take a short second to tell you all that even though the deadline to register to vote in Rhode Island has passed, Rhode Island offers same-day registration for presidential elections, so you will be able to go into Providence and cast a provisional ballot. In case that is of relevance to anyone here, I would hope that you are all already registered, though. Thank you.
I also will also put a plug in for 24cast, just 24cast, all one word, .org, which is a voting prediction model created by two Brown students. It's open source, very interesting to look at, and they've got big ambitions on it. So it's very interesting. It's predicting the likelihood of a Trump victory or a Kamala Harris victory in the presidential race, among other things. So that I recommend. So without further ado, I think we originally planned to start with Ken Block. So let's all welcome Ken Block.
Good afternoon. So I have 15 minutes to give you about 5 hours of material, so I'm gonna just sort of figure out how to hit the highlights. And if I touch on something that you find interesting, please ask for more information. I'll try and bring it out to you. Yeah, I'm the guy the Trump campaign called out of the blue the day after the election in 2020. I and my company have expertise in analyzing voter data. I don't know how Alex Cannon, who was the lead attorney of the campaign, found his way to me. I have no idea how he had my cell phone number, but he called me out of the blue. I was on the back porch with my wife, and she'll remember that vividly. And I guess my jaw was probably hanging down to my knees or lower as I took the call and realized what they were asking for. I had a bit of a negotiation with the family about whether or not I should do the work, and decided to do it because it was unique. It was a unique ability to audit the national election, looking at the data with what I assumed would be and what proved to be unlimited resources. So it was really appealing to me to want to do it, but I also understood all the risks attached to doing the work. And as I thought about it and started to negotiate with Alex to do the work, I told him, I said, I know what the campaign needs me to find, and I'm telling you up front, you shouldn't have expectations that I'm going to find it. And I thought that would end the engagement right there. But what he said to me was, that's perfect. We want you to do a straight up analysis. We're not going to pressure you to deliver results. And I said, that's very interesting. And we negotiated the rest of it. And I thought I was going to hit another showstopper because a lot of contractors for Trump have not been paid, and the work that we were about to do was extremely expensive. And I had to use very expensive data vendors for some of the things that we were going to do, and I didn't want to get stiffed. So I kind of tiptoed around it, and I hemmed and hawed and said, yeah, I'm a little worried about getting paid. And he said, stop right there. I totally understand. You tell me how much money we have to deposit every day, and we'll just send it to your bank. Who could argue with that? And so we started what I would call an insane 30 days of looking for voter fraud, data mining for voter fraud for the Trump campaign, looking for duplicate votes, looking for dead voters in the swing states. And then the day after we signed the contract, Alex was fond of reaching out to me at like 6 in the morning. And I'd get a phone call or a text message, and he would start off by saying, we have this claim of fraud. They want to take it to court. We are doing our legal due diligence on the claim. Can you assess this claim and tell us whether it's true or false? And we did that 20 times over the month of November. And for every one of those claims that they asked me to evaluate, I was able to show them why the claim was false. And I documented it. I sent it to him. We have extensive email conversations. And we wrapped everything up. It was a big nothing in terms of delivering them anything they could use. Alex went on to firefighting whatever else the campaign was swirling around at the end of November. And I figured, all right, we're done. And I went on with my life and really didn't look back on it. And then during the January 6th hearings, I saw Alex on TV being interviewed. They showed 1 minute of him where he was describing his conversation with Mark Meadows, giving Meadows Meadows was Trump's chief of staff, giving Meadows the bad news that the campaign was wholly unable to find any voter fraud that mattered that could have changed the course of an election. And then I realized, that's not good. And I worried about being subpoenaed by the January 6th committee. Not that I was afraid to go up there and give them the truth about what I had done. I didn't want my work being framed by anybody else. If my work was going to become public, I wanted to tell the story without any spin. And I realized that I needed to probably start thinking about writing the book. And I did get on that at the end of 2022, when I got a hold of all of the depositions from the January 6th hearings. Cannon did disclose in his deposition my company's name as having done the work looking for voter fraud. And then I realized that I have to get on it with a will, because that's in the public record. Some of my emails were in the deposition transcripts, and my story was already in the public realm at that point. The one thing that Alex didn't ask me to do when we signed our contract was have me fill out a non-disclosure, which is why I can talk to you about everything today and why I was able to write the book. So that sort of explains, and I'm jumping over all the fraud claims and everything else because that's a whole hour all on its own to talk about them. They're very instructive, and it helps I think, helps people to understand the mania that was underway in November of 2020. It wasn't people delivering proof of fraud to substantiate a legal action. What you had was people making a statement that there was fraud, and then half the country running around like crazy trying to find the evidence to back up the claim, which was made without any evidence. And I was the guy who ended up disproving an awful lot of those claims and keeping some of those claims actually out of the court system because they were so horrendously wrong. The next step on the journey was I was working on the book. And I saw in February of 23, I saw that the Washington Post had a story about another company that the Trump campaign had hired to look for voter fraud. Their name was the Berkeley Research Group. And I worked alongside, I actually trained them on how to look for voter fraud. They were friends of Jared, and they didn't actually know anything about voter data. So I helped get them up to speed and help them with whatever it was they were going to do. And I saw that the Washington Post had said that they had received subpoenas by Jack Smith. And I realized right then and there that the clock was ticking on when I got mine. And about a month and a half later, I got my first subpoena from Jack Smith. The phone call came on my cell phone again. I don't know how the investigators all knew how to reach me on my cell, but he called me on my cell, and we figured out how to get him all my communications with the Trump campaign. And then I started another timer because I realized it was only a matter of time before the Washington Post wrote about my subpoena. And that took about another month. And I got a phone call on my cell phone from Josh Dawsey, who was the Washington Post reporter. And he basically said, I'm running a story that says you got a subpoena. Do you want to say anything? And so he and I began a dialogue that I've kept up over the last year. I gave him dribs and drabs of information. And I told him that, yeah, I did get a subpoena. Yeah, we did look for voter fraud, and we didn't find anything that came close to overturning the results of the election. So wrote the book, have had massive publicity on the fact that I had the job that I had, and I'm talking about the findings that I did, right? I mean, it's kind of a weird thing to be in. And it's been TV, news, international. I mean, I've done interviews with 3 different major German publications, the BBC, Norwegian, whatever it was, and I still don't know what they wrote about me because I can't get it translated the right way. It's been a very interesting journey, and it's all kind of capped off now with another round of publicity, and I fear a lot of claims of voter fraud that are going to have to be seriously looked at over the next month or so. And, we'll look and we'll get through it, and none of the voter fraud claims will likely prove to be true. And then we have to get serious about talking about what we really should do to make things better, because we do have substantial weaknesses with the way elections in this country are run. And it makes sense for why, because we have a system that's 200 years old, has never really been revamped, and we are literally conducting our elections in the modern era in a framework that we were using 100, 200 years ago. And we suffer for it. It's not a good thing. As a technologist, I can guarantee you that if we were going to start with a blank slate and design an election system for this country, there's no chance we would build what we are currently saddled with. The problem is you have to get Congress to agree on making some really big changes, and elected partisan officials of both parties are typically reluctant to make changes to election law unless they feel comfortable that those changes might benefit their side somehow. So there's a lot of give and take that needs to happen, and there's some serious conversations that we need to have because there are some built-in unfairnesses to how our system works. For example, if you vote early and then die before the election, whether or not your vote counts literally depends on where you live. In some states, the vote counts. In other states, the vote doesn't count. In Rhode Island, your vote counts, but there's not a shred of law or regulation that provides the legal backbone for that action to have been taken, right? So a third of the states allow it, a third of the states don't allow it, and a third of the states don't consider that situation in their laws. And that's just one example, and there's much worse problems than that to discuss, but all of it points to correcting the deficiencies that we've inherited over hundreds of years to get where we get to right now. And that's a complicated conversation. I hope we do spend a lot of time talking about that. Looks like I'm under my 15 minutes, and I'll wrap up, though, with this. I didn't apply for the job. I didn't reach out to anybody and say, hey, you know, I know there's a big fat bank account sitting out there. I'd love to do some work for the Trump campaign. It had not occurred to me to even approach anybody to look to do this work. Jack Smith subpoenaed me. Fonnie Willis subpoenaed me. Ruby Freeman's legal team subpoenaed me. At least Ruby Freeman sent someone to my front door to serve that subpoena. Everybody else just calls me on my cell phone. You know, there were consequences to having done the work. I still don't know what my role in any of those legal actions will ultimately be, because all those legal actions are still pretty far away from getting into court. Will I have to testify? You know, I don't know. And probably the wildest thing that happened to me was a Time magazine reporter calling me up and telling me that they wanted to name me a defender of democracy. And they made me one of 11 people that they put in their last issue, acknowledging efforts that we had all made in different ways to defend democracy. And I say that was weird because they're honoring me for doing something that was basic, which is telling the truth. The bottom line is that there was not enough voter fraud anywhere to have changed the election. I told the Trump campaign that. I told all the different folks who subpoenaed me that. And I don't think there's anything heroic about having done that. So with that, I'm at the 15 minutes, and I will turn it over to John.
Thank you, Ken. I know there are a lot of questions we can ask that you will want to answer. So now we are pleased to hear from John Marion, the Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island, in particular about voting rights and election administration, and maybe a little bit of campaign finance. Well, maybe in the Q&A.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, campaign finance. Oh no, didn't prepare for that. Good evening, everybody. I want to thank Professor Schiller, the Taubman Center, and Brown University for inviting me and Ken to join you tonight. I also want to thank the family of John Hazen White Sr., who I don't think is here tonight, for endowing the lecture series. My organization, Common Cause Rhode Island, which has been around for 54 years, actually worked with John Hazen White Sr. back in the early 1990s in the wake of the credit union crisis to reform some aspects of Rhode Island government. So we go a long way back with the Hazen White family. So Ken Block has explained how he was able to debunk many of the false claims that were made by former President Trump and his allies about the 2020 election. Ken has also alluded to some of the data collection challenges. If you read the book, he goes into depth about them that he faced, which prevented him from evaluating the merits of some of the other claims by Trump and his surrogates. I'll get to some of the data collection issues toward the end of my remarks, but to kind of give away the ending, this isn't, we're not writing mystery novels. Politics gets in the way of good public policy sometimes. But first, I want to go back and explain a little why probably I'm paired with Ken here and how we ended up working on these topics. Ken and I actually go way back. If you read the book, I appear on page 232. Not that we're looking for our names in the book. Ken refers to a time when he and I worked together on a project to eliminate the use of straight party voting in Rhode Island over a decade ago. We were successful in eliminating what was called the master lever in 2014, I believe. But after that, we largely parted company. That's about the time the organization I have to run, Common Cause Rhode Island, began in earnest to work almost exclusively on voting rights and election administration. And that's about the time when Ken began his journey to unearth problems with voter registration and the voter fraud that he believes our registration system allows. My efforts and Ken's efforts actually kind of have some odd parallels. In September of 2017, they both sort of reached a crescendo. That month, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a bill that I helped write, making ours the second state in the nation to require something called a risk-limiting post-election audit, which I'm happy to talk about for hours if you want, but rest assured it's an election security measure. That was the first time Rhode Island would start auditing our election results. That same month, and I had forgotten this until I was preparing, Ken testified before something called the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity, which was known at the time colloquially in my world as the Trump Voter Fraud Commission. And he gave a presentation titled Data Mining for Voter Fraud. That commission, I bring it up because that commission was really sort of an inflection point in the journey to what we refer to as the big lie, right? That commission was an attempt to sort of lay the groundwork for the election denialism of 2020. Ken and I think I can speak for him, both believe that the administration and security of our elections needs to be improved. Ken and I, in our own very different ways, have sought to improve those things. How we've done that in different ways is what I want to talk about. I start from a place of believing that the greatest threat to our elections is not misfeasance, is misfeasance, not malfeasance. Elections in our country are largely administered at the local level. Some of those folks are here today. They are chronically underfunded and understaffed. They are far too dependent on voting machine vendors. I've seen problems caused by ignorance or incompetence far more often than I've seen problems caused by malice. Don't get me wrong, I do think there is some malfeasance in our elections, but the biggest malfeasance I see are politicians who want to shape the electorate by suppressing votes, historically, particularly the votes of Black Americans and young Americans. I see, as we speak, the governor of Florida resisting calls by my organization to extend the voter registration deadline, which is today, as a Category 4 hurricane bears down on that state. That is not good. That is playing partisan politics with our elections. That is why when I look at election security, I put equal weight on making sure we are continuing to expand access to the ballot. At the same time, we are making the process secure. I believe we can have both, and I believe Rhode Island has made great strides in the last decade at having elections that are both accessible and secure. So I want to spend most of the rest of my time talking a little bit about that balance in Rhode Island. As you've heard from Ken, elections, one of the problems with elections is that they're administered locally. That means we have a real sort of hodgepodge of systems all over the United States. In fact, in most of the country, they're administered at the county level, even though we don't have counties in Rhode Island. But in 48 states, they're largely administered at the county level. So they're not even 50 election systems. They're more like thousands of election systems. In Rhode Island, things are done quite a bit at the state level with some local variation, but all of us vote in a pretty uniform way because it's a state level function. And 10 years ago, I just want to take you back, just 10 years ago, we were pretty old fashioned when it came to voting rights and election administration in Rhode Island. 10 years ago, unless you were at the Department of Motor Vehicles, if you wanted to register to vote, you had to do it on paper. If you wanted to update your registration, you had to do it on paper. If you were voting, you were more than likely to vote in person on Election Day. 92% of people in Rhode Island 10 years ago voted, or 8 years ago, voted in person on Election Day, which was one of the highest rates in the nation, because we didn't have meaningful access to mail ballots or early voting. We had and still have the longest voter registration deadline in the United States, which was just last Sunday at 30 days. And we're one of only 3 states where that registration deadline is actually in our state constitution. So it's the hardest registration deadline in the country to change. And 10 years ago, our voting machines quite literally were breaking down at polling places, and the state was having a hard time finding replacement parts. And we weren't auditing the results that were being produced by those voting machines. Starting in 2012, my organization, along with many others I'll shout out in a second, began working to expand voting rights and improve election security at the same time. Since that time, and I'm just going to list off a bunch of things we've done. In 2015, the state joined what's called the Electronic Registration Information Clearinghouse, which sounds kind of wonky because it is. We refer to it as ERIC, and this is a system that is at its high point, more than 30 states exchanging voter databases to look for people who aren't registered, but also look for people who might be registered twice or more in the same state or twice or more in other states. So we joined that in 2015. In 2015, we also passed online voter registration, meaning you could make updates to your voter registration on a website instead of on paper. In 2016, we adopted a new voting system, which continues the practice of making sure almost every Rhode Islander votes by hand on paper. In 2017, we became the 6th state to adopt something called automatic voter registration, which changes how you register and update your registration at the DMV, but has increased the number of people who are registered, but more importantly, for purposes of this discussion, improve the accuracy of the address information in our voter registration database for the people who are registered. 2017, as I said earlier, we became the 2nd state to require statewide risk-limiting post-election audits, which are sometimes referred to as the gold standard of post-election audits. 2020, the state, under the sort of threat of voting during the pandemic, finally adopted early voting, and we have a 20-day early voting period. In 2022, we adopted a new system, and I'm almost done with my list, for accessible voting, making it far easier for people with disabilities in our communities to cast a ballot independently. And then finally, in 2022, we also passed something called the Let RI Vote Act, which enshrines some of the pandemic changes to vote by mail that make it easier for people to vote by mail. That's not even an exhaustive list of the improvements that have been made just in the last decade. As I said earlier, this was not Common Cause alone. These improvements were because of the efforts of many groups and individuals, foremost our former Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, and her team. I'm just going to shout out Rob Rock, who's probably there doing work. But hi, Rob. Rob was the elections director under former Secretary of State Gorbea and is now Deputy Secretary of State under Secretary Amore, and has been instrumental in a lot of these changes. All that said, there are still problems that need to be solved. I'm sure we're going to talk about some of them. In our minds, my organization's mind, that 30-day voter registration deadline is one of the biggest one. Not just because if we pass same-day voter registration, would we bring more people in, but we would also clean up the voter rolls. It has the added benefit of cleaning up the voter rolls because it forces us to do a better job with our voter rolls. My job is to focus on Rhode Island and what we can do to improve our elections in this state. Ken has more of a national perspective, and he proposes a lot of nationwide changes in his book that we're going to talk about, many of which I agree with, or my organization has positions that I agree with. However, I think he's ignoring two important facts. First, many things Ken sees as problems really are just the result of political compromise. So yes, the National Voter Registration Act is not a perfect piece of legislation, nor the Help America Vote Act, because it doesn't create a nationwide voter registration list. But that is because there were politicians who stood in the way of nationalizing and continue to stand in the way of trying to nationalize our elections in any way in the name of so-called states' rights. In fact, you can see this. We're going to talk probably at some point about the fact that elections really aren't overseen by a federal body. The one federal body that other than campaign finance has oversight is called the Election Assistance Commission. The very name, assistance, means they don't have legal authority to oversee our elections. In fact, the bill that created the EAC specifically says they can't promulgate regulations on almost anything that have the force of law. So, advocates, pro-security advocates and pro-voting rights advocates have learned to kind of cope with the intransigence by promoting bipartisan policies. So many of the policies I listed before, online voter registration, automatic voter registration, risk limiting audits, membership in ERIC until very recently, have all been adopted by numerous states on a bipartisan basis. The other important fact that I think Ken misses a little bit, though, is that now things, I think, are different, and I'm responding less to his remarks and more to his book here, that now things are different. Since Trump emerged, we've seen one of the two major political parties abandon the concept of bipartisan election administration. Election administration in this country has been built on the concept that the two parties keep each other in check by participating in the administration of our elections. For example, in Rhode Island, each of the 39 cities and towns, by law, has to have a 3-member board of canvassers, 2 of whom are from the majority party, 1 of whom is from the minority party. They are there to keep watch over one another. What has happened since the emergence of Trump is one of the parties, starting at the top down, has largely abandoned that enterprise. And that is the real difficult problem in this moment. We have disagreed on the expanse of voting rights in the past with conservatives in this country, but we haven't disagreed on the idea that elections can be fair if we all engage in that process together. So, I think the best example of this is that the commission Ken testified before in 2017 was called the Pence-Kobach Commission. Republican Vice President Pence and former Republican Secretary of State from Kansas, Chris Kobach. Every prior commission, Ginsburg, Bauer, after 2012, Ben Ginsburg, Republican super lawyer, Bob Bauer, Democratic super lawyer. After the 2000 debacle, Jimmy Carter and James Baker, the former Republican Secretary of State. It was a bipartisan enterprise prior to 2017, and that really is what has changed. So I'll just finish that, I hope and work toward change, but I believe it's going to have to come from the bottom up, not the top down. I think from the top down, one political party has sort of abandoned this enterprise. And if we're going to get back to a point where we can trust our elections because both parties are invested in conducting our elections and trusting those outcomes, it's going to have to come from the bottom up. It's going to have to come from, honestly, Republicans who administer elections who are going to have to turn to the leaders of their own party and say, you're going to cost us elections if you continue to undermine faith in what I'm doing as a Republican election administrator. And that's why, I was glad to see Secretary Raffensperger blurb Ken's book. He is one of the people who has stood up to this so-called big lie and said the elections in Georgia, which, by the way, do risk limiting audits and have automatic voter registration and online voter registration, and we're a member of ERIC, bipartisan policies, they have stood up and said, no, our elections work, and they work in a bipartisan manner. Granted, there are some problems in the last couple of weeks in Georgia, which we can get into, but that isn't Secretary Raffensperger. So I will end there. I look forward to your questions and the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think what we'll do, this is on, is we'll ask Ken Block to respond a little bit to John Marion's remarks, and then I'll open it up for questions, and we'll go back and forth. So we'll open up to audience question, then I'll ask a question, and then we'll do audience questions. So we'll sort of get a good mix of questions in. So did you want to respond to any?
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me okay? Is this, okay. I don't think we should have voter registration. I think we should have a national voter registration, and it should be an ID that every one of us gets the day we're born or the day that we're naturalized. If we went down that road, we would have identification and we'd be able to know exactly who was casting their vote because you have a federal ID, ideally with biometrics on it. You wouldn't have the issue of same-day registration or 30-day registration or any of the other nonsense that we see. The Constitution doesn't say anything about voter registration, and Professor Schiller educated me and told me that voter registration was actually an innovation brought about by, I believe, Democrats in the 1930s, if I have it right, in an effort to, get this, restrict people from voting. So it's, I don't demonize any political party here. Both political parties play for keeps when it comes to election administration, when it comes to trying to tip the balance by passing rules and laws. I had to sue the state of Rhode Island in federal court to convince a thoroughly democratic state that I had the right and ability to try to start a political party. I could not, with the laws as set up in 2008, when I wanted to start the moderate party, it was absolutely impossible to do it successfully because of the rat's nest of laws that stood in my way and made it impossible to accomplish what they asked me to do in the time frame that they gave me to do it. So it's the fact that partisan legislators and partisan politicians are responsible for setting up the rules of engagement for our political system. It sets us up for failure in a lot of ways to get the kind of ideal election system that we deserve. Try and get the Rhode Island legislature to get rid of gerrymandering. Forget it, right? It isn't going to happen. The speaker will never do it, and the Democratic majority here has no interest in undoing something that is fundamentally unfair because it benefits them. Why did it take 50 years to get rid of the master lever? Because the majority party in this state didn't want to get rid of it. And John and I differ dramatically on whether or not we should have a constitutional convention. I believe we need to have one here because the legislature absolutely stone cold refuses to do some of the things that we need to do to move Rhode Island ahead. And I'm talking about a governor's right and a veto, something that 44 other states have in this country and that our legislature outright refuses to do. If you can't get it by moving through your legislature, the only way to get some of these reforms is through a well-run, carefully managed constitutional convention.
I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
I'll let John Marion respond. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, can I make 2 quick points?
Sure.
Yeah, and I realized listening to myself speak there, for those of you who don't know Common Cause, we are a nonpartisan organization. We are clearly pro-voting rights. I did call out the Republicans there. We have a long history of calling out Democrats in the state of Rhode Island. 3 weeks ago, I put out a press release calling out the Democratic administration of the city of Pawtucket for violating the Voting Rights Act and not conducting their elections properly, and CC'd the U.S. or the U.S. attorney for the District of Rhode Island. So I, but we're going to call out whatever administration's doing what, regardless of party. And to Ken's point, yes, redistricting reform has been on our agenda for a couple of decades, and yes, it's going to be tough, but I remain optimistic we'll eventually get it. I do want to correct one thing. We don't have a position on the Constitutional Convention issue. we have not taken a position on the convention issue since 2004. So for those who aren't familiar, question 1 on the ballot on November 5th in Rhode Island is going to be a question about should there be a constitutional convention in Rhode Island. And there are pro folks and there are anti folks, and we're sitting out that fight because my board, one of whom is here tonight, decided that we should remain neutral on that. On the registration thing, without getting into the particulars of whether there should be a national ID card, Ken is learned well from Professor Schiller. Yes, voter registration, we just take it as a natural fact of life, was created as a voter suppression tool. One of my favorite facts is North Dakota does not have a voter registration system. Nobody in North Dakota ever has to register to vote. And it's always been that way. They just never had voter registration. And nobody talks about voter fraud in North Dakota. There is an alternative system, which is we don't have voter registration. I'm working within sort of the parameters of our current politics, which is I think we're not going to get rid of voter registration in Rhode Island, but I think we could change that system to same-day voter registration.
So I'll just comment and then we'll open it up for questions. Voter getting a little, so I want to, hopefully we can get an answer, a clear answer on what we talk about when we say voter fraud. So I want us to think about registration, but then also voting. And what does it mean to commit voter fraud? Does that mean you're voting outside your precinct or your ward or your county or wherever you're registered? Does it mean that you tried to vote 3 times in one day? What does it mean collecting? We've had examples in Rhode Island of somebody dropping off. They call it ballot harvesting, as if it's a terrible thing to do, but you're collecting ballots from different polling places and putting them in a box and delivering them to the Board of Elections. We've had that happen in our state. So I'd like some clarification on that. But going back to registration, the reason it's stuck. We think about policy innovations. How are they sticky? Do they come into existence, and do they stay or do they go? And as a voter registration tool for suppression became also a means of campaigning. So as you get more technologically advanced and as there's more money in politics, it's very helpful for candidates, particularly incumbents, to know who's registered to vote, because they used to tailor their knock on doors, texting, contacting campaign, and fundraising campaign on registered voters. So it became something that was a tool of incumbency advantage, as well as voter suppression, but also voter mobilization for only those voters you knew that are registered to vote, and you would tailor your campaign that way. So it became a bipartisan advantage for incumbents and for parties in power. So that's how things sometimes stick. So could you give us an example? We've talked about registration. What do you need, literally? We talk about the motor voter law that was passed in the 1990s under former President Bill Clinton, which allowed people to register to vote when they got a driver's license. We've just had, I believe the state legislature has approved offering driver's license to people who are undocumented, who are not U.S. citizens. So let's just take that example, because that's an example that the Trump campaign throws out about sort of how you open the door to voter fraud. So let's explain, what does it take to get registered, and then what does it take to actually vote, and what does it mean for voter fraud? So can you answer the registration question, and Ken, you could take the definition of fraud.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in there. So in America, Congress made the policy choice to link voter registration very closely to having a driver's license. That was done for a fairly practical reason, which is that there is a law in the 1970s, I think it's called the Privacy Act, that Congress passed, that limited the use of Social Security numbers in government databases. But there was an amendment in 1976 that provides some exceptions for certain government functions, including driver's licenses. So a decision was made by policymakers in the early 90s, I think it was 1993, when they passed the motor voter law that, hey, we don't really have a ID number for everybody in a state, but we do have Social Security numbers, but we have to be careful with them. DMVs are careful with them. They have protections in place. So let's kind of, and most people have driver's licenses and interact with the DMV. Let's make that the main registration agent in most states. And so we've kind of backed into this weird system where driving and having a license is very closely linked to voting. It's uniquely American. In other countries, the two have nothing to do with each other. It makes things a little complicated for a variety of reasons. One of which is, increasingly we see people not driving. I have twin 19-year-old daughters. One of them has chosen not to get a driver's license. So she wasn't offered the chance to register to vote that you're offered at the
Lucky
DMV.
you.
Yeah, you don't have to drive my daughter around everywhere. But thankfully I have twins, so the other one, I leverage the other one to drive her. We're developing, as more people don't drive, particularly with the kind of Uber economy, linking those two things together has been bad, particularly for young people in getting them registered to vote. Thankfully, there have been some innovations at doing it at other government agencies and so forth. So I don't think I'm fully kind of answering your question, but I wanted people to have that background about like, what does my, that one thing have to do with the other? So into the question of driver's licenses for folks who are undocumented, yeah, so separately, this other issue has arisen that some states have chosen to give driver's licenses, to issue driver's licenses or driver's privileges cards to folks who are undocumented. There are huge efforts in place in states where that is true, including Rhode Island, to make sure that the voter registration function of a DMV is not accidentally resulting in undocumented folks registering to vote. If you know one thing, I took immigration law a couple years ago. If you learn like one thing in immigration law course, it's like committing a felony, which registering to vote if you're not a U.S. citizen. That includes green card holders, legal permanent residents, and all sorts of other folks in other status, is like a one-way ticket to deportation. So folks non-citizens don't want to register to vote because it's a ticket out of this country. So I don't know the particulars. I haven't been involved in implementation in Rhode Island of the driver's privileges cards, but I know, and I'm sure you could talk to the folks from the Secretary of State's office about the steps they have taken to make sure at the DMV the two aren't, that folks who are going in to get a driver's privilege card aren't being offered the opportunity to register to vote.
Okay, I'm just going to clarify. So the distinction that you're referring to is that one is a driver's license, the other is a driver's privilege card. So they actually have different names.
Yeah, I believe in the law. I'm going to look
At the Deputy
I think
Secretary of
that's
State.
what they're. Yeah,
Okay.
that they're physically the same, but they're treated differently in the law. It's not. They
Okay.
didn't just take the section of Rhode Island general laws that talk about who can get a driver's license and say these
Okay.
additional people can get a driver's license. It's a whole other section.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. So,
That was okay.
Ken, voter fraud.
Do you want me to talk about real voter fraud or imagined voter fraud?
Real voter fraud. I mean, I really
Okay.
like us to know, well, what does that look like? I mean, what does that mean?
Okay. So over the years in 2020, I identified two individuals who registered to vote in September 2020 who had been dead for years. And I saw those registrations in October of 2020, and I said, these will become fraudulent votes. And they did. The votes were cast. They were counted, even though election officials were warned about them. After the fact, there was a prosecution and two convictions. Both of those voters were relatives of the deceased, and they were both Republicans who cast the deceased vote on behalf of Trump for their departed one. In Arizona in 2022, there were 40 individuals registered to vote in Arizona and in some other state, and their Arizona voter registration had an out-of-state mailing address to the address in the other state where they were also registered to vote. And I could find the votes for those people at both of those different registrations using their own voter registration data to find the companion vote. 40 individuals did that, comparing Arizona to, I think, 10 other states. And this situation arises because states aren't good because they don't have a great tool to identify where their voters are registered someplace else as well. ERIC is sort of that John had talked about earlier is a partial solution. I believe the EAC should have mandatory participation by every state, and they should do that function to help states clean everything up. 35 of those 40 fraudulent votes, including a husband and wife who voted together at their Arizona address and their California address, were Republicans. So the narrative that voter fraud is a Democrat crime is not true. In my experience, in all of the different fraud I've seen over the years, individual instances of fraud, not mass examples of fraud that were coordinated, it's a bipartisan activity, usually by somebody with the privilege of owning multiple homes in multiple places. So those are two examples of fraud. There are other examples of small examples of individuals committing mail ballot fraud, filling out multiple mail ballots on behalf of others and filing them. You don't see that often. It's actually hard to get away with that in theory, because if the election infrastructure does their job right, it should be pretty apparent what's happened. And massive organized voter fraud is incredibly hard to slip by, because you have to leave fingerprints all over it. If you want to manufacture 10,000 votes, you have to do an awful lot of work, and it's pretty hard to hide all the work that you'd have to do to pull that off. So, our undocumented immigrants risking everything to vote, I seriously doubt it. They're here to work. They don't want to stick their necks out. They're not looking to call attention. And honestly, there's very little for them to be gained personally to participate in our elections. So the focus on voter fraud generally by the Trump campaign, the focus on the efforts of undocumented immigrants to overturn our elections by participating in them, this is all political theater, much more than it's a serious conversation about some sort of fraud that may or may not be happening out there. And it's really hard to combat this theater because it's protected speech. So I see that as one of the biggest problems we have. And the fraud that I'm most worried about, real life potential voter fraud, is hyperpartisan election officials, high-level officials, who take actions to support their team's candidates at the expense of others, acting in an illegal way. That's never really been something that's been out there that was a potential for us to experience. And I think it speaks to some extent to what John was talking about, where we've lost bipartisan participation. The examples I'm talking about in this case is there were some conservative county election officials in 2022 who refused to certify their election results in their counties without a valid reason. They wanted to make in the legal record, they said that we wanted to make a political statement. So if you're willing to act in an illegal way by not certifying the votes, I think there's very little that would stop you from maybe throwing out every other Democrat vote as you're processing mail ballots. So, and in heavily conservative not even conservative, in districts where there's a huge imbalance between the parties and almost all of your election officials are of one party, in our hyperpartisan times, I believe we are at risk to see some examples of that kind of fraud coming up in this election, because we have already had a little bit of a taste of what I think is coming. And I think that's one of the bigger risks that we have in this election. It's not individuals taking two bites of the apple is probably always going to happen unless we can seriously clean up our voter rolls and come up with a way to help the states remove duplicate registrations from all over the place. And by the way, there are millions upon millions of duplicate registrations out there, people registered to vote in multiple places. That's not the big problem. It's a problem, and it's one that we should solve. The big problem here is making sure that partisan election officials don't step out too far outside the boundaries of what's legal.
Do you want to respond to that? And then we'll take a question from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for like definitional purposes, there's a distinction that I think is really important, which is voter fraud versus election fraud. And most of what Ken talked about in his examples were examples of individuals who've committed voter fraud. And it is exceedingly rare. There's a lot of people who spend a lot of money looking for it, including Ken, and cannot find lots of instances of voter fraud. And then there's this prospect sort of election fraud, that people are kind of rigging the outcome of an election in a coordinated fashion. There are almost no examples of that. There are. He mentions one, a really interesting one in the book. In 2018, there was a candidate for Congress in North Carolina who engaged in a system of mail ballot fraud, and ultimately, correctly, that result was never actually certified by the North Carolina Board of Elections. They conducted an inquiry, and there was a new election, and I think some of the folks who committed the fraud have gone to jail. So, but that was a common 19th century political machine sort of thing. That just, our system has changed sufficiently that we do not see election fraud the way we did in the 19th century. It just, as Ken said, it would just be almost impossible to do. Doesn't mean people don't try, as they did in North Carolina, and has happened in a few other places, but that is exceedingly rare. I will say, like, that one of my problems I've had with Ken and has been sort of his rhetoric sometimes. So, like, yes, there are lots of duplicate registrations, and it makes sense why they are there. And they're there because the law is written to be protective of people who are registered to vote, so they're not kicked off. And so I'll go back to my family. I have 2 kids. They just went to college in September in states other than Rhode Island. They just went to register to vote in those states, right? And they're going to spend the next 4 years there. They chose to register to vote in those states. They're still on the rolls in Rhode Island. They're coming home for fall break. I'm going to take them to the town clerk's office. We're going to fill out the form. But at the moment, my kids are on the rolls in 2 states, right? They're not going to vote in Rhode Island. I guarantee you that. I will kill them if they do. But they're going to vote in the states they're in college. They're, by Ken's definition, they're duplicate. Like, they're registered in 2 places. There's a logical explanation for the vast majority of the duplicate registrations. It's because the National Voter Registration Act, the so-called Motor Voter Bill, makes it somewhat, has procedural hurdles to removing people from the voter rolls. I will give you the reason why we do that. So just really briefly.
He has props.
I have a prop.
I will say my daughter attends college in New Hampshire. The day she same day registered to vote in the 2022 election up in New Hampshire, and her registration was promptly and automatically removed from the Rhode Island rolls. So my point is, just to, and I know you're gonna, I don't want to take your time, but when I talk about the duplicate registrations, it is eminently possible to not have people registered in multiple places. We have the technology to do it correctly, to do it cleanly, and my daughter is an example of that. And I want to see that applied across the board so that we can remove one of these big integrity arguments that are out there, because it is a little bit weird that you can be actively registered in multiple places.
Yeah, and I don't disagree that it can be weird, but there's just a logical explanation for why it exists. But I have a table. This is from a talk I gave on voting rights. The southern states, this was pre the Voting Rights Act passing in the 1960s. In 1947, 1.2% of Black Alabamans were registered to vote. Right? Those were the days when they would try to stop you from registering to vote if you were Black in Alabama, or if you managed to clear the procedural hurdles, they could just kick you off. There were no federal protections from kicking you off the voting rolls in Alabama in 1947. I mean, it was 17.3% in Arkansas, 15.4% in Florida. those numbers by 1966, right after the Voting Rights Act passed, were all over 50%, right? Federal protections against kicking people off voter rolls are incredibly important from preventing what we saw in the South, Democrats, under Jim Crow. And that, I believe, would happen if we remove the federal protections.
So we're going to push past that. I will say that Black voter registration in the South is now close to 70% of eligible voters. It is slightly higher than white voter registration in the South now. So it's just something to build on that point. So let's open up to the audience for some questions. I'm going to ask Rosie maybe to, if you raise your hand, we can bring you a microphone. Who wants to?
Hello?
Yeah.
Good,
We
okay.
hear you.
Mr. Block, if I may address this to you, you brought up the issue of non-disclosure. And that kind of spawned three questions in my head. The first one is, were you surprised when you were asked to sign? Or were you expecting to be asked to, and let me give you all three just because they kind of roll into each other. Were you expecting, or have you been asked before that you sign one of those non-disclosure agreements? The follow-up question to that would be, if you were asked, would you have said no, or have you been in that situation before? And the third question is, if you do sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then you get subpoenaed to a congressional hearing, or you end up in court for a criminal or a civil event, does that get negated, or what happens?
Yeah, the non-disclosure does not supersede the federal subpoena or the state subpoenas. So I would still have to turn over all my communications under the subpoena if I was non-disclosed. I offered the campaign to, I assumed I would be asked to sign a non-disclosure. I said so to Alex. I have two thoughts on it. Things were very hectic, and he just needed to get this piece of his operation in place and move on. He told me that. But reading all of the deposition transcripts, and I don't know how many of you guys read Jack Smith's most recent filing, all 165 pages of it. But if you read it, it tells a hell of a story. And the story is that there were multiple importantly placed Republicans who were doing the right thing and trying very hard to keep the train on the tracks and trying to squash the false narratives of voter fraud. And Alex Cannon, who I directly reported to, was one of them. His boss, who was the main go-between between the campaign and the Oval Office, was another one of them. And I half wonder if he didn't want me if he decided he wasn't going to have me sign a non-disclosure just in case. He was definitely on the side of truth. So I haven't talked to him directly since November of 2020. He did text me and say, I expect to get a book and have you sign it. And I did that.
Thank you for the questions. We have a question right here.
Yeah.
I'll bring you a microphone. Thanks, Hannah.
This is also for Mr. Block. Do you know whether Alex, who communicated your findings to Mark Meadows, then Mark Meadows communicated your findings to the president?
Yep. Meadows, again, the Washington Post had a first-class pipeline into the grand jury proceedings. Meadows did testify to the grand jury, and what he told them, per the Washington Post, was that after Cannon told him there was no fraud, he brought that message into the Oval Office.
Do we have any other questions at the moment? Yes, Professor White.
Thanks. First, a very excellent panel. Thank you for all of your contributions to this. I want to ask about trust in elections. There's been a significant decline in trust in the electoral process and the actual procedure of voting. And so this is a question for both of the panelists. Do you have some thoughts about the role of technology and changing technology in improving trust, since some people distrust technology or technological innovation itself?
Gotcha.
Yeah, want me to start? Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because I think One of the weird things that is happening in this moment is, there's a rejection of technology. So we haven't talked about the fact that there's like an active movement by election deniers to push for the hand counting of ballots, even though the scientific evidence is that hand counting of ballots is at mass scale is more inaccurate than using tabulation, automated tabulation by machine. So, but like machines can fail, and we need to audit them to make sure they didn't fail. So it's really tricky. I've seen lots like folks in the voting rights community do lots of message testing, and there is no sort of silver bullet message out there about how to restore trust via transparency or technology that I've seen. There's no like single message. I think the most important thing I have like personally witnessed, and I think the data bears it out, is when people understand the process better, they have more trust in that process. So I can say there is a member of the state legislature who was a huge skeptic of the use of mail ballots in Rhode Island. And he spent an afternoon at the State Board of Elections watching how a mail ballot flows through the system. And now he will publicly vouch for the integrity of mail ballots in the state of Rhode Island. Like, he was a public critic and has gone to a public champion of mail ballots. I've never seen anything like it. And it was because he took the time to do this. One of the discouraging things I have found is, we build transparent processes, and this gets to one of my themes, which is one of the parties have abandoned sort of the bipartisan administration of elections. I help create these risk limiting audits in the state. They're by definition observable. They're a process that you're supposed to be able to follow every step of the way to confirm the results yourself. Nobody shows up for these. I'm like the only guy who shows up every time they do one of these as kind of the groupie. And the idea is trust through transparency there, but if nobody's taking advantage of it, it's a problem. In the Republican Party in the state, and again, I sound like a partisan, but I swear to God I'm not, is a couple of weeks ago, they appointed an election integrity officer. And I got asked for a comment by one of the newspapers about it. And I was like, it's ridiculous. They're going to have this guy who has this ill-defined role as sort of finding problems with our elections. The party, like literally, I wrote the regulations for these risk limiting audits. It says like both parties get to have people participate in these audits, and the party doesn't send anybody. Actually, neither party does, to be quite honest.
You need to serve better snacks.
Yeah, we need to serve better snacks. But like, so it's just like a little window in there where like, yeah, I think transparency could help. I think learning a lot about the system could help, but you can only kind of preach to the people who show up at church, and they're not coming.
I don't think you solve the problem of the skepticism about how we run our elections until the current class of candidates stops beating it as a rallying cry to their base. Because you cannot have a rational conversation about it. You simply can't. I've tried. I actually did a 1 hour, more or less, debate with Mike Lindell. And it's on YouTube.
That's the My Pillow guy.
And he didn't even get a free pillow for being on the show.
No, I would have suffocated myself with it if I was given one. It was very difficult because it was difficult for a lot of reasons, because he doesn't shut up. He throws 20 things at you, and you have to try to parse out which 2 or 3 you're going to respond to. But he absolutely just confuses everything on purpose, because they had someone at some point somewhere said something, and therefore it's got to be true, right? And that's the nature of the conversations right now. And it is political propaganda There's no rational way to really talk about it. I've tried. And by the way, for all the media attention that I've had, I have not been able to get anywhere close to Fox News, okay? Which is a whole nother topic for a whole different panel about the dysfunction in media today, but I'm gonna stay away from that right now. But I wanna talk about hand counting real quick, because Lindell is one of the biggest voices calling for the elimination of ballot counters, and he wants to do it by hand. So I decided to do some math in Maricopa County. In Arizona, there's 1.5 million registered voters. Most of them are participating. On your typical Maricopa County ballot, especially this year, there are over 70 candidates and questions. When I say candidates, 70 races and questions on the typical Maricopa County ballot. 1.5 million ballots times 70 puts you up to 105 million different election results that you'd have to tabulate by hand. And if you had somebody with superhuman powers who could tabulate 1,000 different races an hour, which I think is impossible to do it by hand, you would spend, I think the number was 33,000 hours of hand counting at a pace that nobody could keep up. It would take years and man years of effort, and there's no chance it would be anywhere near as accurate. But you can't have that conversation with Mike Lindell. You can't have that conversation with most of your average man on the street Republicans, because what they're hearing from their news organizations and from their politicians is it's bad, 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 bad. And they're not thinking, and they're not processing, and they're not hearing, most importantly, countervening ideas, right? We live in a society right now where half the population is hearing one thing and half the population is hearing something else, and neither one of them really are hearing both things at the same time. So I'm pretty pessimistic about it. We will clear out of this. I think we're going to clear out of this mess at some point. We need to get through this election, and hopefully it sorts itself out, and hopefully we can get ourselves back on track.
So I'm going to say one thing, and then I'm going to take your question. So there are 500,000 elections every 2 years in America. Just about 500,000. If all levels of government, that's a lot of elections. I will say that what this is that we talk about the resistance to voting and the worries of voting fraud, but we have had record turnout. 2018 in a midterm was record turnout, close to record turnout. 2020 was a very high turnout. 2022 in a midterm was a high turnout. So it's interesting that, and there are a lot of Republicans and Democrats, Libertarians who are voting. So they must have some faith that their vote will be properly counted because they're turning out to vote, they're returning the mail ballots, and the West, to Professor White's question and answer, the West is adopting mail-in ballot at bigger numbers. Idaho is mail-in ballot. Utah is moving to mail-in ballot. Nevada's moved already. So you're having a sort of a west to east sweep of more Colorado mail-in balloting. And for those of you who are younger, Colorado used to be a little bit more red than it is now. So it's interesting that there's this sort of populism about being able to vote and being able to vote more easily. And there's a lot of people who are voting, and yet there is this pervasive rhetoric that somehow these other votes will count and my vote, will get overwhelmed, but I'm still voting. So we're not at 100% voting. We have 61 or 63% turnout in Goodyear. So there are different strains of behavior that we're seeing in American politics now in terms of voting. So I just want to leave that, not to lift the whole gloom and doom, but just to say that people are not always rational in their behavior and then their sort of beliefs about what happens to their votes. So let's go. We're going to close out. So if you'd like to ask the last question, and then we'll have a little bit of time for people to come up and talk to our panelists after we're done.
Thank you. This dovetails kind of a little bit about what you were just talking about. There's this problem with misinformation and an inability to have a rational conversation about it with a growing number of people. And this question is for both of you. I've watched you professionally for a long time. I'm a local election administrator in Cranston. I struggle with this myself. How do you combat it? How do you combat misinformation in a world where sometimes you just can't have that conversation, and it makes you feel like it's not worth it to have that conversation, whether it's directly calling things out on social media or talking to the press or writing a book or any other means of getting the truth out there, or at least having a conversation about it out there. So my question is, what's your ideas or strategy to how to change that in the future? Because if we don't do much, we're going to have a lot more of those county commissioners who don't want to certify elections because they truly start to believe this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a grand answer. I will say I think it is one person at a time. At some point, I got a call about 3:00 this afternoon from somebody who had seen some pictures and thought those pictures meant something fraudulent was happening. And I spent half an hour on the phone with her. She sent me the pictures. I walked through what she was seeing in the pictures and gave the rational explanations for what were in those pictures. And, I think she walked away kind of convinced that, this was just something normal, but because, the thing we forget, like, we all care a lot about politics. The average person doesn't actually care very much about politics. So people go to vote and they don't remember it the way it was last time. So they immediately suspect something, and we just kind of have to deal with them one at a time. I voted early for the September primary in Rhode Island in my town. And there wasn't a lot of early voting happening that day. There was one other couple in there. They got their ballots, and they were like, "Where are the presidential candidates?"
Yeah.
This was, I think, September 3rd or thereabouts. And the patient poll worker was like, "This is the primary. This is where, the presidential primary was back in April." I do this for a living. But I just forget. It like pops the kind of information bubble I live in when I hear somebody be like, "Where are the presidential candidates in September?" But those people, just needed to have somebody kind of explain to them in very simple terms what was going on, why those candidates were on the ballot they were seeing, and they went ahead and voted. And I think it's going to have to be one at a time. I do agree with Ken. I think hopefully the optimistic side of me is like the fever will break. Yeah. And that honestly, like, the Republican Party will realize it is not a path to victory to convince their voters that elections don't work. Yeah. And I think we've already started to see that, where the RNC is putting out a lot of messaging that is pro-mail ballot, even though Trump has put out a lot of messaging that mail ballots are fraudulent. The RNC recognizes particularly older voters in Florida like to vote by mail. And so they're recognizing that, crap, this is not a winning strategy to convince our voters that elections are fraudulent. And so my hope is there's a feedback loop that comes from the party recognizing that they've got to enforce some discipline there.
Yeah, I believe you have to talk about it a lot. I've been talking about it a lot. I was on C-SPAN this morning. We took phone calls from all over the country. Some of them were unhinged. But if you ever see me in these, taking these sorts of questions, even whether it's with Lindell, whether I'm talking to a conservative blogger, whether it's taking phone calls from conservatives whose, drawls I could barely decipher, right? You have to, my approach to it is treat them all seriously, treat them all with respect, and try to very carefully unwind what they said and try to show them where the kernel of truth is. And I've been doing that a lot for the last year, and a lot more of it has to happen. I think it needs to happen on a much bigger scale than it happens, because there's just too many people to try to do it on a one-by-one basis. I think you have to do some mass communication. I planning on a lot of exposure as we get into election night, and as we start dealing with the claims of fraud. I will be talking about it everywhere they'll have me. And I think the only way to combat it is to just very soberly and as interestingly as you can, talk about it, show them how what they're believing is wrong for whatever the reasons are, try and hash it out, and hopefully enough people saw that interaction that you can begin to change hundreds or thousands of minds. But none of that will matter if I can't get on Fox News.
So I want to, before I thank the panelists, I also want to say that one of the simple things we can do is when we go to vote in person, we can, I think we might be inclined to do this, but, obviously show respect for the poll workers, show respect for them when they ask for the ID or they're taking a little bit of time to look you up or whatever happens, not to be impatient, not to act like there's something wrong, like something is broken. And if there is a broken machine or there is something wrong, there's usually a poll watcher there, or you can make a phone call to the Board of Elections. But, the security and safety of our poll workers and our election workers who are our unsung heroes here, and anything we can do as participants when we vote, I think will be helpful to creating an atmosphere of respect and legitimacy. So I hope that we can all do that. I think this was so terrific that I'm now officially inviting these two panelists back for a post-election conversation. We'll have to wait until the spring when all this dust is settled. And I'll leave you with this thought that if the
scary.
the president of the United States stays the president until somebody else is sworn in. And in 2020, that was Donald Trump. In 2024, 2025, that will be Joseph Biden. So it's a very interesting situation that we may face. Thinking about drawing the electoral process out, hand counting, all the things that people may want to do, just basically keeps Joe Biden in office for longer. So it's a different post-election scenario than it was in 2020. So I'm not advocating for keeping Joe Biden in any longer. I'm simply saying that it's a different potential post-election scenario. So I want to thank you so much, Ken Block. Thank you so much, John Marion. Thank you to the audience for coming. Thank you.